fight for and have to put up with.
Obviously, AIPAC is a big part of this conversation because Israel has become a very central topic, especially inside the Democratic Party, but nationally as well. Do you believe Israel has a right to exist?
So, Casey, AIPAC's become a big issue in this election because AIPAC's already spent $30 million in this election. They're by far the biggest spender in the race. Now, the question about a right to exist, it's interesting because nobody's ever asked me whether or not I believe Palestine has a right to exist. Every single president who served has said that they believe in a two-state solution. Israel exists. The question is whether or not we want a politics where our money is sent over to Israel to do genocide and apartheid instead of investing in our own kids.
You say it exists, but does it have a right to?
No, I didn't say that. I just said the question of Israel's existence is not a question. I'm not going to play this gotcha game about whether or not it has a right to exist. The question ultimately is about whether or not we want a politics that dignifies.
You're not going to play the gotcha game, but you're not going to say you think Israel has a right to exist.
Well, my question, Casey, I think the question we all ought to ask is, does everybody have equal rights to peace, dignity, and self-determination? That's Jewish, Israelis, and Palestinians. And to me, the folks who should answer what the ultimate peace there looks like should be Jewish, Israelis, and Palestinians. I want my tax dollars spent here in Michigan to provide schools in Michigan, to build healthcare in Michigan, to invest in Michigan, rather than to be sent abroad to kill Palestinian people, do genocides and apartheid. The question about whether or not Israel has a right to exist is actually quite secondary to whether or not they have a right to our tax dollars. And people don't ask that question in good faith. So if you want to ask me about Palestinian right to exist, if you want to ask me about what I want to do for kids in Michigan, I'm happy to answer that question. But the AIPAC and Israel have become secondary questions that too many people have to talk about because our tax dollars keep getting spent over there rather than being spent over here.
Can you clarify for us what your position is on funding for Israel if you do become a U.S. Senator? Are you opposed to all funding for Israel, period, military funding?
I'm opposed to unconditional military aid for any country. That is Israel, yes, but that's also Egypt, where my family immigrated from. That's Pakistan, that's Saudi Arabia, that's UAE. And that's not because of a focus on what's happening anywhere except for a focus on what's happening here. We've got communities in my state where the median income is $14,000, and I believe they have a right to their tax dollars. I also believe in international law and upholding international law, and there are Leahy laws against dealing arms to countries who are engaged in human rights abuses, and I don't want to fund a foreign military that does genocide, apartheid, or has taken us to a war we don't need to fight. I believe in equal rights to peace, dignity, and self-determination for Jewish Israelis and Palestinians alike. I believe our responsibility, though, more than anything else, is to use our tax money here in Michigan to provide healthcare in Michigan, and schools in Michigan, and roads in Michigan, rather than to send it to a foreign government that might use it in the form of bombs and tanks to destroy infrastructure and schools and hospitals there.
Some people might hear that and say, well, does he support, funding defensive systems like the Iron Dome in Israel? Do you?
I don't believe that there's really a difference between offensive or defensive weapons. And I also don't believe it's my responsibility to buy defensive weapons for a foreign government when our kids are defenseless against schools that have been underfunded for a very, very long time. My responsibility as the next senator from Michigan is children in Michigan, rather than thinking about what's in the interest of a foreign government.
Okay, so that's a yes, that you are against funding to things like the Iron Dome.
I am against it in large part because I just don't understand why anybody thinks it's the right thing to do to send our tax dollars abroad to fund foreign militaries when our own kids barely get to go to schools that are functional.
Can you clarify?
Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah, Bahashem, Bakakwadash, and double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone who rule well. Peace, love, and salutations to the hopeful elect. This is your brother Dawadah from the Men of Valor campaign in Greenville, South Carolina, coming back with another video in sincerity and in truth. And Lord willing, it can be edifying. And I just played 2 TikTok clips from this guy who's now a senator, if I'm not mistaken, for the state of Michigan. All right, but he's clearly against the tiny tots as far as America's, allegiance to them. So what you saw from the 2 news anchors that were questioning him, it's funny that they, with all these different senators and those that are in Congress, all right, which further proves that is compromised and occupied by a foreign party, if you want to call it that, a foreign entity, that these questions keep coming up when it comes to American politics. What is your stance on Israel? All right, and they're talking about the tiny tots. They're talking about the state of Israel that was established in 1948. And for decades, America has, claimed that this state was their biggest ally. You got all these presidents and senators and congressmen and whatnot going and kissing that wall and pledging their allegiance. All right, but with what happened in Gaza, which is plainly a genocide, which they're not supposed to be in our land either, but the covering cast over all the people is starting to thin out. All right, that veil is thinning out, because for the longest time, and with these other generations, these older generations, especially if you were rooted in Christianity, they were told that's the only time they would use the Old Testament, is to say basically like what Ted Cruz said, like, oh, the nations that bless Israel will be blessed, but they're not the true Israelites. Okay, and even us, the true Israelites, so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, and the speckled bird, because Israelites are scattered among all nations. They look like every other race under the sun. Okay, so you're going to have Israelites that look like white people, so-called. You're going to have Israelites that look like so-called Japanese, Chinese, that look like so-called Africans. You're going to have some that look like so-called Arabs. You're going to have some that are still in the land that look like tiny tots. Okay? But what we are saying is those that are proclaiming to be the Lord's people in that land are not. Because where are the rest of the tribes? And why is this such a point of discussion? Let me read this right quick. Because, hey, these devils are getting exposed. It says, following his victory in Michigan's Democratic Senate primary, Abdul El Sayed told CNN that he does not believe the United States should fuel either offensive or defensive weapons for Israel. El Sayed argued that American taxpayer dollars should be focused on domestic priorities, pointing to issues such as healthcare, infrastructure, and roads in Michigan rather than foreign military aid. You take away who they're talking about for a second, that makes complete sense. Okay, from a person that's running for a local office, that's supposed to deal with a, presiding area, why wouldn't you be focused on helping that particular area? Why are they automatically? They're not even talking about helping boost Americans' military. They're talking about funding for a foreign country's military. How American is that? It's not very American at all. But hell, they already signed into legislation that America's military, along with Israel's military, is already tied together. So it doesn't even matter if you want to, whether or not you are okay with the funding of it. It's already signed into law. They already tied their militaries together. So that doesn't even matter. All right, but his argument was completely logical, not even trying to pick sides. And what these damn Edomite women and these Edomite anchors, what they do, because they're set up, because these media platforms are owned by the tiny tops. Just like they own the banking system, just like they run the jewelry district, just like they own, the movie industry, just like they own the music industry. They own every damn industry, man. Best believe there's a tiny top at the end of damn near every business deal. Okay, so how can you be the people when the Lord said that the Lord's people would be oppressed? We'd be under the curses. We would be the tail and they would be the head. We would have to get money lent to us, and we won't be the lenders. They're the fucking lenders. So how are you the people? How do you match up with Deuteronomy 28 chapter? The curses of Deuteronomy 28. 15 on down. That doesn't apply to you. You set up a banking system that keeps you, in control of these different nations and their policies. The Federal Reserve is not a public, it's not a government entity that prints our money. You know, so this video isn't about this guy in particular, but I've been hearing a lot about him, and the fact that AIPAC, like you mentioned, AIPAC spent $30 million on the campaign to set up somebody against him, and he still got up in there. You know, so hey, Esau, hey, his enchantments are failing. All right, people aren't falling for his bullshit anymore, and they're not falling for the thoughts and beliefs that those tiny tops are the people of the Lord. Yeah, the older generations might have believed that, but hell, I remember I was speaking to these two chicks that were in college. They went to South Carolina, and this was some months back, and we were just having a conversation, and they were starting to whisper to me like, hey, you know, what the fuck is AIPAC then? You know, we don't stand with Israel. Like, they were open about that, but see, they were so they were trying to be secretive about it because their parents are still heavily intertwined with it. See, the Lord is shaking up the family structure. You know, he's setting a man at variance against his household. You know, he said these children aren't, you know, believing the lies that their parents believe that help the state of Israel get to where they are now. So what's going to be the result of this? They're going to squeeze out so-called free speech. They're not going to allow any type of, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not going to allow any type of criticism against the tiny tots, man. All right, and that's going to bring about the famine of hearing the word of the Lord, because if they're not going to allow any criticism about the tiny tots and whether or not they're the people, because they hit you with that buzzword, that buzz phrase, do you believe that Israel has a right to exist? Like, what the fuck does that mean? Have a right to exist, you know? And he wasn't arguing whether or not they had a right to exist. He was arguing whether or not America should be sending their taxpayer dollars to these genocidal maniacs, because that's what they are. And now with alternative media, you got cameras and everybody has a camera phone. They saw what they did to Gaza, you know, so-called fighting Hamas. They saw them killing women and children. That's hard to defend in this modern era. You know, you can't really flip that. And this is the Lord coming up against his devil once again. This is Exodus chapter 17 and verse 16. And he said, because the Lord, Yahweh Bahashem Yahweh Shah, have sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. The Lord got smoke with these tiny tots, man. All right, and he's put them in the land. So he hates them so much, he allowed them to get into this land just to show his power in taking these devils down. And he's got them tied to America, which is also going to be destroyed. And by this alliance between the tiny tots and the Americans, the rest of the world has alienated these two nations. Even within NATO. NATO ain't fucking with, you saw what happened with Spain. Spain was speaking out against these tiny tots, even though they just won the World Cup and shit. They've been speaking out against these tiny tots, and what happened? They sent these migrants into their territories, man. You know, they talk about the Israeli cyber warfare, or they call it cybersecurity capabilities, you know, but also their co-op, the Mossad. You know, the Mossad, I'd argue, is 10 times more powerful than the CIA. You know, the Iranians just arrested a bunch of Mossad agents that were working inside of Iran. You know, best believe they're embedded in damn near probably every nation. And that's how this seemingly small nation has been able to control, you know, nations' monies and their politics and shit. Even America, you know. Didn't Bibi just pull up here the other week? You know, he's talking to Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio. He's pointing fingers at him and shit. You know, they show you who's in control. You want to know who's in control? Find out who you can't criticize. And they're making it plain upon tables that you can't criticize this particular people. You know, and that's going to lead to the famine of hearing the word of the Lord, which is part of prophecy. You know, they're going to come against us. They're going to demonize us, you know, for speaking out, for speaking the truth, because they hid this. They spent all this money to cover this up. to keep us from figuring out who we were. But the Lord, like it says in Revelation, the 11th chapter, that the Lord, after 3 days and a half, the spirit of life from the Lord entered back into them. You know, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. So, you know, they had us down. They had us fucked up for a time. All right. And then the spirit of life from the Most High entered back into us. And now we're standing upon our feet. Now they scared. All right. You know, the truth doesn't have to be heavily, censored or contended against, so to speak. You know, if they were telling the truth, they wouldn't have to come after everybody that spoke against them. You see how they did Kanye West, how they did Nick Cannon, how they did Kyrie Irving, you know, for criticizing them tiny tots. And this was a couple years ago. If they were the people, why isn't criticism allowed? See, when we get back in the land, nobody's going to be questioning whether or not we're the people of the Lord. You're going to know it. Okay, this is Amos chapter 8 and verse 11. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord power, that I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. All right, just how you're able to hear our videos on YouTube, you know, the elders and apostles, great millstone to the men on down, you know, and we're calling this devil out to his face on his platform, you know. And the old CEO, that woman, she was a damn tiny top, man. Right? But there's going to be a famine of hearing the word of the Lord. We're not going to be able to be on the highways and hedges much longer. We're not going to be able to post these videos on the internet because they're going to come down with this anti-small hat, censorship. You know, you speak out against these damn devils and they got nuclear missiles, man. They got the Samson option. So the Lord is ultimately going to take this devil out of the way. You know, but this is why they've been able to maintain control over this course of time. All right. But see, there's cracks in their armor. And people are starting to find out, like, okay, when I put two and two together, this shit doesn't make sense. So now it's being exposed that, you know, America is so heavily intertwined, you know, with these tiny tops. They receiving money from foreign lobbies, AIPAC. You know, AIPAC shouldn't have as much power as they do within Congress, you know, within the House of Representatives and shit. But they do. You know, they're all in the president's ear. You know, BB comes over here. He the only president that came here 7 times since Trump's new term. You know, Putin ain't been over here. Xi Jinping ain't been over here. And I believe Modi came over here or something. You know. And if they have come over here, it definitely wasn't 7 times. 7, 8 times. So that show you who's in control. Verse 12, and they shall wander from sea to sea, and from the north even to the east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it. Why? Because they about to scrub the internet, man. You speaking out against these tiny tots, man, you going to get thrown in jail. You know, hey, I saw Marco Rubio, he was speaking. You going to get your visa denied if you criticize the state of Israel. Not if you criticize America, not if you criticize Trump, but if you criticize the state of Israel, man. That's how much it runs deep. That's how much they're trying to hide from who they really are. Because really, you're Amalek. And they're even trying to say, you know, that this person is Amalek and that. No, you're Amalek. And the Lord said he would war with you from generation to generation. And you appointed the Lord's land into your possession. That's another way that we know who you are. This is Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 5. Therefore, thus said the Lord power, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen and against all Idumea. And Idumea is the Greek way of saying Edom. And Edom means red. All right. Edom is a so-called white race, which I've appointed my land. All right. The Lord's land. And to their possession with the joy of all their heart. When did they do that? 1948. Okay. The Balfour Declaration. And the Rothschilds, the government of Great Britain and the Americans helped set them up. And as soon as they got over there, all right, now Isaiah the 2nd chapter say when our people, when we go back to the land, the nations shall learn war no more. When these devils got into the land, they got to fighting instantly. And they've been fighting ever since. So how can they be the people? They don't align with biblical prophecy other than they align with this right here. You know, the Lord said he's pissed off. He says, which have appointed my land into their possession with the joy of all their heart, with despiteful minds to cast it out for a prey. All right. Who did that? These tiny tots, man. They're in the Lord's land right now, proclaiming to be, because at least those Palestinians over there, they're worshiping Allah, you know. These devils are proclaiming to be us. Okay, because Jew is just short for Judah, which represents the so-called black man. You know, is what they call them now. You know, that's the southern kingdom, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Then you got the northern kingdom. But they're in our land, proclaiming to be us, and criticizing anybody that criticizes them. But the Lord is making them small among the heathen and greatly despised. You know, their lies are being found out. What does it say in Jeremiah 50? You know, the least of the flock shall draw them out. You know, they're the least of the flock. These tiny tots are the least of the flock. They're about to draw all these nations into World War III, man. Okay? So I just wanted to cover that through the Spirit. Lord willing, it was edifying. I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah, Bahashem, Makakradash, and double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone who rule well. Peace, love, and salutations to the hopeful elect. Till next time, Shalom.